I would like, as Secretary General of the International Association of Universities and very proud partner of our colleagues here around the virtual table, and especially the Council of Europe and the International Consortium in the US, but then as well from Japan, from Uganda, and again, speakers from the USA and from Romania. Very pleased to welcome you to this very special webinar. The topic of the webinar today is higher education's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, building a more sustainable and democratic future. And we hope to be able to debate many of the aspects that come with such an important and promising title. So we're very pleased to co-organize this webinar together with the Council of Europe and the International Consortium, in particular also with the Netter Center, because Ira, that's also where you're based at the University of Pennsylvania. This webinar is part of a larger series of webinars, the IAU webinar series on the future of higher education. That's why we're very pleased to actually host the first webinar on the topic, higher education's response to COVID-19 pandemic and building a more sustainable and democratic future. But this is only the first one of 3. There are 2 other such webinars foreseen, one in Ireland and the next one in Ecuador. So it will be interesting to have conversations about the many topics that the contributors to the book that is actually the backdrop for this webinar have touched on, and to debate them in different contexts. So we hope you will take the chance to also ask your questions in the Q&A, the Q&R section of the webinar, or in the discussion space, and I will pick that up a little bit later on. The webinar is being recorded, so we will be very pleased to share it with the participants, those who are live with us today, but also to the 200 other people who registered for the webinar. We had 340 approximately participants registering from all around the world, and we hope for a very good debate towards the end of the discussion that we will start in a minute. So there's a very nice publication that comes with this webinar, and Sjur Bergan will be talking about that. And as well, the opportunity to engage further if you're interested in more in 2 other webinars to come. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to Sjur Bergan at the Council of Europe to introduce the speakers from around the world, and also to present the publication that we're very pleased to have realized and to share with the broader higher education community. So the word is yours, Sjur, and thank you for taking the floor.
Thank you very much, Hilligje, and thank you to the IAU for making this webinar possible. Let's go back about a year when COVID was something new and we were preparing for how to cope with it. In fact, the date of this seminar is particularly well chosen from a French perspective, and both the IAU and the Council of Europe are based in France, of course, because France went into its first lockdown exactly 1 year ago tomorrow. We realized early on, of course, that the COVID pandemic was likely to change higher education. We realized that we needed to respond to this together experience. And I think we also realized that it was an experience that would not be over with immediately. Although I think, to be honest, most of us thought it would be over with a bit sooner than it turns out. So the result of that is this book, which is the higher education response to COVID-19, with a subtitle, Building a More Sustainable and Democratic Future. The purpose of the book was to look at the variety of experience in different parts of the world and from different backgrounds. It is really an international effort, and the editors, the initiators are, of course, Hilligje van 't Land, who needs no further presentation, Ira Harkavy, the chair of the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility and Democracy, and also the founding director of the Nether Centre at the University of Pennsylvania, Tony Gallagher from Queen's University Belfast, and Ronaldo Monk from Dublin City University, and myself. What we aimed to do was really to put together experience and advice from different areas, both from an institutional perspective, from the perspective of public authorities, from a policy perspective, and also looking at some more specific areas. So in this book, you will find 31 chapters written by 42 authors from Europe, from North America, and most of the authors come from these two continents, but also from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'm happy to see that some of the authors are among the participants today, but I'm particularly happy that 4 of the authors have agreed to join us for this webinar and share their experience in alphabetical order. There are Ligia Deca, who is the education advisor to the president of Romania, who also has a past as a student leader, as a president of the European Student Union. Barnabas Nawangwe, who is vice chancellor of Makerere University in Uganda, one of Africa's really great universities. Paul Pribbenow, who is president of Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and of course in the US. And Naoto Yoshikawa, Vice Chancellor for Global Initiatives at Tokai University in Japan. The format that this first part of the webinar will have is that of a talk show. So we'll try to get a conversation among the participants with relatively brief answers. And let's start off with Ligia. As I said, Ligia, when you were invited to write your chapter for this book, many of us expected the COVID crisis to be more short-lived. And in fact, at some point we were concerned that by the time the book was published, it might not be as topical anymore. How has your perspective on the COVID crisis evolved since you submitted your chapter, and what would you write differently if you're invited to write today? So Ligia, over to you for 3 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Sjur. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here at this webinar and to reflect on what has been quite a year for societies in general, but for education in particular. When it comes to higher education, I think the overall expectation of the society and of public authorities is that their autonomy would help them take the best decisions when it comes to ensuring both the right to education and the right to health. So when I look back at the past year, I see that, for example, universities in the Romanian context were left by the government to take their own decisions when it comes to suspending face-to-face classes and switching to online and adapting to the COVID pandemic restrictions, with the exception of the state of emergency in which all public services were halted when it comes to face-to-face presence. And that after a whole year, you see different approaches, as you would expect. But what it became clear increasingly is that even though the pandemic has not disappeared, we are increasingly rethinking the role of universities, especially when it comes to various other international trends like digitalization, like flexibilization of routes, like micro-credentials, and so on. So I think what COVID did is to make us rethink many of the processes in place to support education. For example, the whole bureaucratic part of being registered as a student in a university has by force been digitalized in many countries, including Romania. There is an increasing conversation about whether or not some of the things we've gained, like online platforms, like skills for the faculty to be able to deliver courses online should be kept even after the pandemic. But at the same time, we have conversations about the added value of face-to-face interactions, especially when it comes to certain programs like medicine, for example, or engineering, but also what it means to deliver some of these hands-on educational experience in a pandemic time. So I would perhaps insist on the challenges that the COVID pandemic brought on institutional autonomy and academic freedom in these times.
Thank you very much, Ligia. And I think all the elements you brought out, things we could discuss for a long time. But turning to you, Barnabas, Ligia talked about rethinking higher education. If you were to draw on your experience and rising to the challenge of COVID, what could the rest of the world learn from your experience, from the way you have met these challenges at Makerere? Barnabas?
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that in May 2018, I attended a conference in Beijing organized by UNESCO on artificial intelligence. And most of the participants, for some reason, happened to be from Africa. And I was wondering why, but then later on, one of the UNESCO officials said, why we organize this is we really want to know whether Africa will again be left behind. Now that was a very strong statement. Africa being left behind again. It means Africa has always been left behind. And that is a problem that we grapple with every day in our lives. The COVID-19, to some extent, came as a rude wake-up call for African universities. Because all of a sudden, all communications, all travel, and all partnerships were shaken or broken completely. And the challenge then was, what do we do then? So people started thinking seriously that yes, we are here as universities, maybe we are the ones to provide the answers to the problems that we face. And so a lot of African universities got very much involved in handling the COVID pandemic, especially at the beginning, and coming up with the solutions. And up to now, people are doing research and coming up with very good innovations that are helping to manage the pandemic. But one other thing that happened was then related to artificial intelligence and IT, for that matter. Africa has, of course, suffered for a long time with, from the digital divide, that we are so underdeveloped in this area. And much as we have tried now to introduce ITs and the online education because of the exploding population, we were doing it at our lukewarm pace. But when COVID-19 came, we said, well, it seems now we must begin running. And so there has been a tremendous effort to introduce blended learning, both online and physical, where it is possible. And I think if you want to say what can the world learn from what we have done, is the tremendous possibilities that can happen when people are faced with a real danger. And for us, COVID-19 was a real danger, and we had to fight to survive. And to a large extent, it has been a blessing in disguise.
Thank you very much, Barnabas. I think you also pointed to very many elements that we could keep discussing for quite some time. But let me pick up on one of them and turn to Naoto. Naoto, Barnabas mentioned in particular artificial intelligence, and of course Japan is known as a country that is well in the forefront when it comes to technology. When you think about the what we optimistically perhaps call the post-COVID world, or at least the time after the immediate crisis. What do you think are the most important COVID lessons that we should take to this future? And to what extent is artificial intelligence a part of it? Naoto?
Regarding the technology-wise, we are kind of, honestly to say, Japan was a digital transformation was a kind of behind. However, and we could catch up very shortly. We could do that at the university. Also, so like I really believe that this moment, in a way, we can take advantage for the using the online class or transferring the information using the online. However, we realized that this one, unfortunately, we couldn't write in the article. This is on behalf of the Chancellor Yamada and Dr. Nakamura, mainly this wrote in this book's article. And around that time was basically July. And so we realized that after that, the student doesn't come to the class, doesn't come to on the campus, we cannot have a dialogue with the faculty and the students or among the students, or student cannot learn the social skills. And maybe information and knowledge they can get from these advanced technologies. However, at this moment, what I really believe the Japanese university try to educate a student for the global citizenship. And that's very difficult from only the online educations. So maybe this is the future. We have to really think about it, how to dealing with this, how to making a dialogue properly, and like a face-to-face stimulation to communicate with other different friends, different people. And this is, I think, that our university's challenge at this moment. We feel like that. Otherwise, maybe nature of the COVID-19 make a country isolated. Foreign students cannot come. And the diversity and the inclusions, we try to making a most important of the value of the democracy, try to educate in the universities. And it was getting very difficult how to also, we have to dealing with after COVID-19, we have to really think about. And that's our challenge, I think, I believe at this moment.
Thank you very much, Naoto. Now, Paul, turning to you, Naoto mentioned educating for democracy, Ligia mentioned institutional autonomy, academic freedom. So this points to values, and of course, higher education is also and not least about values. In your view, how should higher education develop a commitment to democracy and human rights in new generations, and how does the COVID crisis influence this in your experience? So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, sir. It's wonderful to be here with my distinguished colleagues. Good day, everyone. Yeah, I think that this is a particularly fascinating moment for higher education to think exactly about how we lean in to what I would say, at our best, are the kind of democratic impulses of higher education, where we believe, in fact, that those values that are embedded in our charters and our missions actually call us to the work of democratic engagement. And in many ways, I think my colleagues have done a wonderful job of actually naming the tensions, if you will, so between public health and economic well-being, between academic freedom and the kind of control of authorities, between technology and face-to-face. In some ways, those tensions named in this pandemic time actually give us the opportunity as institutions to lean in to what those values are going to mean going forward. They open up a conversation. And for Augsburg in particular, located in Minneapolis, as you said, one of the things that has happened here, of course, is that the COVID pandemic intersected with the kind of economic disruption that came about with people losing their jobs and in addition to the racial reckoning that happened just a couple of miles from our campus where George Floyd was murdered. And so we have what I would say are actually three intersecting pandemics that have opened up a whole range of issues that we are called, I think, as higher education institutions to really both dive into, to explore, to lean into, and to name our vulnerabilities, if you will, the places where, in fact, we haven't lived up to those highest aspirations. And for me, those are grounded in our value, at least in the U.S. context. One of the things that I believe deeply is that we make a mistake when we think about democracy simply as a creed or a governmental system. It's actually a social ethic. And as a social ethic, it calls us into a way of being in community, if you will, being in solidarity with each other, which then opens up, I believe, a context for this work that we do together. And for me, this is my 20th year as a university president, I've got my eye on that horizon beyond the pandemic, where in fact we won't give up on those questions because those questions now become even more pressing.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to all of you also for giving very brief and concise answers to difficult questions. Now moving to the second round, maybe I'll start with Barnabas this time around. And Barnabas, you mentioned that this could be, in a sense, a blessing in disguise, something that opens up opportunity also, and you did mention a possible digital divide, but in your view, is there a temptation both for higher education leaders and maybe public authorities to try to move higher education online as much as possible, maybe to save costs, maybe to open opportunities? What is your view of that? How should higher education develop in this dimension over the next few years? Barnabas? Barnabas, your microphone is muted.
Sorry.
And now it's muted again. I think. Okay, try again.
Yes, I think it's okay now. Yes, sorry about that. Talking about how higher education should develop now in Africa, given what has happened, I think there are about three crucial things to consider. One, the population of Africa is growing at a very high rate. And there are a lot of children who are going to be demanding opportunities for higher education. And we do not have the spaces in the schools and the universities to take up those students. Two, we still suffer from the digital divide. And much as Africa has been developing very fast in as far as the mobile telephony and the internet is concerned, the uptake is still relatively low compared to the rest of the world. But things are somehow changing. And so for us, if we are going to deal with that huge demand that is coming, there is no choice but to develop the blended learning and especially online education, because I don't see how else we are going to manage that. Now, of course, there are challenges which will be faced as we do that. First of all, the computers and the internet that are required for this are still in low supply. So it is a little bit of a dilemma. And that has actually affected even our move to online, with a lot of students saying, no, we cannot access internet. Even when we have got the gadgets where we are, we cannot connect to the internet. But others saying, I cannot even afford a smartphone or a computer for that matter. But we are telling them, but now there is no alternative. We just must move on. So people must now choose between priorities and say, yes, if we want to continue studying this, we have got now to divert some of the resources we have, the meager resources, to actually being able to continue learning. And that means moving to the digital era. And so I think people are beginning to understand that, yes, first of all, COVID-19, we are not even sure when it will end. Universities and schools have been closed for a year and there is no light at the end of the tunnel yet. A lot of the schools are still closed. Many schools have actually completely closed. And so what is the alternative? The alternative is very clear. Move as fast as we can online.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Barnabas. And that was also very clear. Naoto, you talked in your first intervention, I think, also about the importance of academic mobility. You said one of the challenges is the fact that academic mobility stopped very suddenly, and we're seeing it as having some problems picking up again, yet it is an important policy goal. So from your perspective, how can we make academic mobility both important and real again?
Well, at this moment, of course, we have to settle down the COVID-19. Otherwise, we cannot mobilize the student. However, what we can do at this moment is, because like a living dormitory in the different countries, like a student, and they live together, they can make it much more easy to understand. Everybody talking about the intercultural communications, like those things become friends, make it much more easy to understand. And they can, but we cannot do like those things at this moment. So in order to, even like this, like a kind of the, try to making a discussion forum among the students, we try to making the best as much as we can. So, and also the, of course, this is like a face-to-face stimulation. We don't have it, a kind of the isolated, but we have to like try to making a student possible can imagine. That's always used to be, I think, old academy making happened to creating imagine to the student to understand detail what we don't know. So like a kind of the, we can make a kind of virtual communities, try to students to discuss and freely, and that's kind of the atmosphere we have to create for the student. But of course, if COVID-19 will be ended, and we can possibly mobilize a student again to in and come and study abroad or whatever. And at this moment, like online also, if we can do, like we can share also the classroom to the world. Maybe we can do that.
Thank you very much. Now, Paul, I think both Barnabas and Naoto have pointed to a broader issue, which is that of the future of international academic cooperation. And Barnabas pointed to blended learning, which is already a kind of cooperation. Naoto to academic mobility and its alternatives. In the broader sense, how do you think we can best promote academic cooperation in, I guess, what we still optimistically call the post-COVID world? Paul?
Yeah. Well, I think it will become more important than ever, because if there's nothing, if there's anything this pandemic has taught us, is that no matter where we are in this great globe, we're all in this together. And so, in fact, the opportunities to think about coming out of this pandemic and actually strengthening those ties becomes very important. And I think there are a whole range of ways of doing that. Augsburg University has international campus sites in Namibia, in Mexico, and in Latin America. And what we have learned during this pandemic is that the faculty that we have in those sites actually can be teaching students here on our campus, and because we had no other alternatives. We could not send students to those countries as we would normally do, but we were able to use those faculty using the technology, and I think that is something that will continue. And we have found those courses to be some of the most popular. So students that perhaps because of their circumstances here would not be able to travel to Namibia for a semester or to Latin America, all of a sudden are given an opportunity to engage with faculty who have those experiences. And we have found that to be a very compelling part of what we've learned during this pandemic. So I would see ideas like that. We certainly will want students to travel. I mean, I want to travel. We all want to be able to travel again. But at the same time, some of the tools that we've been able to use and had to use during this pandemic have actually enhanced some of our opportunities for internationalization. And we're I have no doubt that that will continue to be the case.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now, Ligia, you represent a different perspective in a sense in this debate, because you're the one representative here of public authorities. And actually from a country that has been remarkably successful in many ways of meeting the challenges of the COVID crisis, not least when it comes to vaccinating people. How, in your view, has the relationship between public authorities and higher education institutions been in facing these challenges, and have higher education institutions helped public authorities in a way in facing the crisis? Ligia?
Yes, well, in our case, I think the universities mobilized remarkably well from the very early stages of the pandemic. I remember March and April last year, when, well, not all cities had labs that would allow COVID testing, while many universities had the necessary equipment but were not certified as state labs to be able to test. So the cooperation between state and local authorities and universities was very fast in order to increase the capacity for COVID testing. But at the same time, many universities that had the personnel to supplement the medical staff in various hospitals did so, including support for students, medicine students, to actually supplement the human resources that the country had for taking care of those infected with COVID. So I think it was one of the brightest moments when it comes to cooperation between universities and public authorities. At the same time, I think universities helped in other more subtle ways, in the sense that some of them actually established platforms for fact-checking and for disseminating scientific information when it comes to the pandemic. As many other countries, in the press and on social media, we had a lot of disinformation regarding COVID, conspirationist theories, fake news, and so on. And I think universities were very good in getting their people out there to try to distinguish scientific fact from half-truths or fake news. So I think that was very valuable. And finally, I think many universities found the society a more community-oriented role with this pandemic, because many of them opened their resources online. And I think this idea of flexible learning paths when it comes to higher education started to become more tangible with the pandemic. It was clear that through open educational resources or open research databases, you could reach more people and draw people closer to the academia in general. So I would be very happy if we would explore those possibilities in the future with all these digital tools that we've, well, forcibly created in the past months.
Thank you very much, Ligia. Now, with Hilligje's permission, I would perhaps go one more round with our panelists before we turn over to question and answers, also because you've brought out so many different elements that, in a sense, come together if we look toward the future, because there's probably hardly a word that occurs more frequently in higher education debate today than quality. And yet we tend to talk about quality as we actually know what it is. It's out there and you just have to achieve it. So my question to all of you would then actually be, in what way will the COVID pandemic redefine how we see quality in higher education, and how will we need to adapt to act to achieve quality in the future? So with this easy question, as goes for all of you, I will turn maybe first to Paul, then to Naoto, then to Barnabas, and then give Ligia the final word. So Paul?
Fortunate me, I get to go first in response to that big question. Well, let me come at it in this particular way, in the same way that I talked earlier about the importance of a democratic social ethic. I think we also need a democratic understanding of quality. I believe that one of the things that we learn from those, especially as we think across the globe, we think in the US context about our BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, people of color, students coming to us from those communities, they are actually coming to us with different knowledge and different ways of knowing that actually can change the way we think about how we define quality. So when I think about our Indigenous students and their care for the land and the challenges of climate change, what wisdom do they bring to us that perhaps we do not include in the ways that we take a kind of more scientific and more Western kind of perspective on those challenges? What do we learn from the trauma that our African-American students have borne in their lives for generations that actually can shape the way we think about how we teach in the classroom? And so that is something that is very much on my mind and as part of our university's work. To think about what I call democratic excellences, democratic qualities that in fact can, I think in many ways, transform what we live into. And so instead of worrying about somebody else's arbitrary rankings, somebody else's arbitrary ways of defining quality, we actually begin to have almost a kind of indigenous, if you will, kind of way of growing into an understanding of what excellence is. And that to me is terribly exciting as we live into what a 21st century version of higher education looks like.
Thank you very much, Paul. And democratic excellence is certainly a term that we will write down and take with us in our further work. Naoto, if you think of how Tokai will be a high quality, continue to be a high quality university 10, 15 years from now, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think also that this is not only Tokai University, all of the Japanese university getting a kind of tendency to the vocational, like a technology development, innovations, maybe management, accounting, like getting like that way too much. And however, this COVID-19 makes us recognize we cannot anyway isolate it to live on. Even if you have a high technologies, even in order to dealing with even the COVID-19, we have to globally, we have to cope with each other. So maybe also this is again, what is a university? What is a higher education's role? We have to think about it. And this, our article mentioning about living knowledge, which meaning is the knowledge and method which can be contributed to the actual global societies. So maybe academies, we have to also really think about promote a dialogue, collaboration, diversity and inclusion. By the same token, understand the importance of the democracies. That's a place we try to be a place so we can be an excellent university. I think we can be, and we can contribute to the democratic world.
Thank you very much, Naoto. Now, Barnabas Macaret is one of Africa's great universities. How will you make sure that you remain that 10, 15 years from now? How will you see quality as defined in your university? Mike.
Sorry, I think Makerere being a kind of representative university for Africa, I can only say that African higher education has learned huge lessons in the last 3 decades. First of all, beginning with the World Bank policies of the 80s and the 90s, which convinced our governments that there was no need of investing in higher education and they should invest in basic education, and the universities suffered a lot. At that time, the universities were few, but even the few suffered from denial of resources to actually develop quality. And that became even worse with the period of liberalization in the 90s, when there was now massification of higher education with many universities coming up, many of them without actually the academic staff to manage the universities. But I think all that has taught us big lessons. And what we see as how we can maintain the quality that we have here at Makerere University is continue with our internationalization programs, collaborating with other universities which do some things better than we do, and then we can share with them what we think we do well. And also emphasizing research becoming truly part of what we do in our academic program. So I think those two are crucial. Improvements and the moving towards a research-intensive university, as well as promoting internationalization, even despite of the current circumstances.
Thank you very much, Barnabas. Now, Ligia, turning to you, of course, the question is not so much about a specific university as about a higher education system in Romania. Barnabas mentioned investment, and I guess that's on the minds of public authorities, but what else would you see?
When it comes to quality, I think if we look at the purposes of higher education, I think the pandemic brought a challenge to how we managed to maintain all of these purposes of higher education programs. For example, how do you let someone graduate when they couldn't be face-to-face enough to be able to have enough experience as a medical resident? Or how do you let someone graduate who did not manage to go to an engineering lab? And I think that that's a real issue. And I think universities had to prioritize as never before, who to bring, in face-to-face, in labs and so on. And at the same time, we need to also make sure that people remain in a mental state to be able to learn. And I think this was an increasing challenge for the faculty to make sure that people still have enough mental space, enough autonomy, enough independence, and enough mental strength in the end to be able to continue their learning process. And finally, I think it's about what we want to test, what we want to make sure that people gain. When we talk about competencies, we talk about knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And some of these are easier to test in an online format than others. So it is a real challenge when it comes to quality assurance frameworks to ensure quality in a pandemic time. And I think we need to redefine what quality means and could mean in this time, and what do we need in the future as a sort of update of our quality assurance frameworks to make sure that we are able to function in a resilient way in these times as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all our four panelists for really having risen to the format so far with pointed and brief responses to difficult questions. But there are more difficult questions and more challenging questions in the chat field, so I turn over to Hilligje for the next part.
Thank you, Sjur, and thank you for all the speakers for the very good insight already provided. And there are questions both in the Q&R and in the discussion part. So I've tried to look at where I could also ask you to contribute to the different points that were raised. I will start with the first one by an anonymous participants. Others I can cite by name. But who was asking, yes, there are plans for bridging the digital divides. And this question was more specifically to you, Barnabas, but actually do also touch on many issues that are faced in particular, I would say, in Latin America, to make a comparison. But the question was really, and so there is a need to move fast and as fast as we can online, as you said, Barnabas, but then how to do that is possibly the question. So if you may give some answers to that broader question.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very complex and important question. That is the biggest problem that is actually facing higher education in Africa, almost in every part of Africa. And we find that we are demanding that we must move online, and yet the people we want to move online are saying we do not have the facilities. So some of the things we have done in order to make it easier for students to access online programs is, for example, this negotiating with the service providers of internet to do what we call zero rating our websites, which have the materials which the students need to access or where they attend the classes. And in Uganda here, we have done that. So the students who are accessing our websites do not have to pay for the access. That has been a contribution by the service providers. Secondly, we are negotiating with banks and the other organizations to be able to enable the students to purchase laptops and the other gadgets through a hire purchase system, where students pay a little money at a time, but they already have the gadget. So that is one thing that we are doing as a university, but the government also has programs that they are putting in place to make facilities available to students. So yes, we are approaching it in a multi-pronged way, but as a university, that's what we are trying to do for the students.
Thank you. I think there is a lot that is being done indeed, and maybe one next session could be devoted as well to actually this issue of bridging the divides. There are many different forms of that, and there are quite a few questions, and I will go back to Pribbenow here on the notion of quality. You made you equaled quality and excellence. That was interesting, and you also had this quote about democratic quality, which is a fascinating quote that we will use in different forms and shapes in the future, quoting you of course, and maybe asking for a next paper. But on this issue of quality, there were quite a few questions that I will bring together. One was, how can we ensure that higher education institutions that now have to juggle with these two parallel systems, the online or the hybrid forms or the face-to-face, and how so how will they both be of equal quality? What is the recognition there, and how will that be possible also in the future? Then there was that question that Ligia was also alluding to, when you have these students that have now gone through a first round of graduating and could not access the campus, could not go to the labs in the same manner. How will they be tagged as those with a COVID graduation, or will they be equally recognized for the qualifications that they have gained during the pandemic? So it's a mixed bag of questions. I don't know if you also looked at the Q&R, but many do actually touch the issue of quality and recognition of that quality. So Paul.
Yeah, no, I think Ligia pointed to exactly the challenge we have, because I think that in the context of this past year, many of our institutions in the US and I'm sure around the world have had to be much more flexible, if you will, in terms of these kinds of questions. I mean, I think we were caught in a situation where, especially last March, when we pivoted completely online, when in fact we had never been there before. Our faculty both were learning how to teach. Our students were learning how to navigate their classes in a Zoom format or other formats, and so we were able to say in this context, especially for that last academic year in the U.S., that in fact there is something on their transcript that notes that it was that year. I think for when you start moving into some of the technical areas, medicine or engineering and the like, the truth is I don't think anyone here in the U.S. at least has given up on the fact that those students still need to accomplish those kinds of clinical or practical experiences on top of their academic degree. I don't think anyone believes that in fact we're going to send a nurse or a doctor into a setting when they haven't had that experience. So often what that means is that their time in school has been extended, and we've had to adapt to that as well. I do think, at least in the U.S. context, of course, we have a fairly significant sector of institutions, organizations that provide online learning, and though they're not all held to the same standard, there are some that are doing this work at a very high level in terms of quality and have developed rubrics and metrics for, in fact, judging. And I think this is one of the places where, in fact, our more traditional institutions may learn from some of those institutions that have actually developed ways of judging quality. And of course, again, in the US US context, we are all held accountable to peer review accreditation. And so there are a set of standards that are applied. And so if we are providing online learning, we have to live up to those standards going forward. And I would say this just in general, as we come out of this pandemic, for places like Augsburg, which have been almost entirely face-to-face, we actually will probably expand our online offerings and thus take advantage of what our faculty have learned, especially in this year, about how to teach online and the kind of flexibility it's given us for students, perhaps in different kinds of settings. We too, in the US, do have a digital divide, certainly not the scale that we know is the case in Africa and other parts of the world, but it is the case that urban-rural divide. Many of our students did not have the technology to be able to take advantage of the education, and so we had to invest heavily in providing some of that to them. So, so a whole range of issues that I think have taught us important lessons that, in fact, will be addressed coming out of the pandemic.
This is directly linked to a series of questions by Maria Keplinger, Collins Chong, or Kural Ul Ain, or even Elizabeth Balbachevsky from Brazil, where they all actually ask the question of inequalities. So how are universities going to debate or to take on board future discussions or even current discussions on inequalities? Paul, you touched on it, and Barnabas as well. But maybe we can hear from from you, Naoto, as well, from a Japanese perspective, this issue of inequality of access, not only the technological part, but I think it was Elizabeth Balbachevsky who said, what about spaces, safe spaces to learn? Or how about ensuring that the spaces for dialogue, because you gave the example, Naoto, of new spaces being created for students to exchange, but how to ensure these are safe? Because we now see, for instance, that these discussions are being recorded, used and abused against people, either staff or students, that the people are being silenced. So there is a whole range of new issues coming up as well by moving online and not having the more simple or more straightforward face-to-face discussions that we used to have previously, but where the online space comes with new challenges. So maybe from a Japanese perspective, you could address that.
Yes, and online also the student, like even the foreign students, they don't want to complain about their government online. And this is in the fact actually. And so if you're discussing much more freely, and of course we have to, like at this moment, what we did in the, our universities, we call to the small, like a 10 to 15 students in a big classroom. And it's a protected areas, but we have to enhance like that kind of, how to say, sometimes we have to making such kind of a special environment. We have to make for the student. So as mentioned, we can dialogue with the students, among the students. They can think about, they can learn from the other people's opinions. And those things are more important. And it is basically, it is very difficult to the online. And also the many students, because of they know the technologies also at the same time. So they don't trust. And what they are saying is maybe somebody can listen, somebody jumped in, even a kind of a closed place. So that's, as I mentioned to the before, we have to making such kind of the safety dialogue place for as a university. That's I believe the academic freedom, which we are start losing it. And people, that kind of control, if we can do only the knowledge and the information, if you're giving to students, many universities satisfied like that way, but which our job is, I really believe, not like that only the knowledge and the informations. We have to make a student can also critical thinking, creative thinking. They can make to find out from others. That's kind of the atmosphere, special atmosphere. It is challenging at this moment, but we try to making such kind of place as much as possible for students.
Thank you very much, Naoto. Then I have a question for you, Ligia, and then we'll turn to Ira. I see that we're moving far too fast into, or do we still have a little bit of time? Tell me, Sjur, am I wrong on the timing here? We still have a little bit of time?
I think we still have some time, so you can still...
Okay, that's good. So we have a bit more than half an hour. Is that it? Yeah. Because there are questions coming in and very important ones. And I would like to share with you the question by Marianne Persoons, Ligia, from Belgium, who's asking a very important question as well. And I will read it out. In building a more sustainable and democratic future, what can universities do to influence the public debate and political decision-making? So you're on the political decision-making, but you can still advise. Have they spoken up sufficiently to keep sanitary policies proportional, time-constrained and balanced with the right to education and offer aid and other HR? And safeguarding public budget, so it's a complex question, i.e. for education, social policies and healthcare in general, that is highly needed for building back better. So it's the whole building back better agenda with the UN as well that is alluded here. And what next? How are we going to do this? Are there enough voices in academia that warn for the risks of a sanitary crisis turning in a crisis of democracy and rule of law in the name of security? So do you see that come also to you at the government level? Do you see universities speak up? Do you see that opportunity? And that is a question that probably would be equally important to look at from a Ugandan perspective, US one and a Japanese one. So I start with you, Ligia.
Well, I think there is something to be said about this role of universities to sort of maintain this honest broker role between, you know, safeguarding public health and sort of sending the signal that, you know, if we keep the sanitary measures too strict, then, you know, other areas might have an enormous impact on the future of our societies. I wouldn't say that the voice of universities has been very loud on these issues. I think there were concerns about potential financial cuts in light of the, you know, the economic impact of COVID. And I think universities were vocal about that. They were also vocal about the role of funding research in order to be able to be more resilient when such crises hit and to sort of predict better things like that and to come up with solutions faster. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they were heavily invested in that discussion of balancing between pandemic protection and democratic culture. I think we could still have that discussion in a much more grounded way and, you know, scientifically based way. I think a lot of the debates were very polarized. So people that argued for protection you know, despite other effects of these sanitary measures, and there were others which were very skeptical of the sanitary measures from the beginning, using democracy as a pivotal argument. But indeed, universities could be more outspoken when it comes to different perils of ignoring, you know, democratic culture concerns, when it comes to maintaining these restrictions, societal restrictions that appeared with the pandemic. So in my view, I think universities try to be there when it comes to fact checking and, you know, providing scientific information. But I think when it comes to the political debate, at least in Romania, many of them try to stay clear of that debate. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the reasons have to do with self-protection, I would imagine.
Okay, so let's hear from the universities then, what they think about it. Let me start with you, Barnabas. Do you believe that you as a rector or your teams around your university as an institution has been vocal about these topics and really has engaged. I know we've taken you away from a discussion with the minister today, but you will pick up that conversation at a later time. And do you believe that the university is more protecting itself, or is it also vocal on saying, hey, careful, the universities are the key stakeholders to a democratic future, and universities can play so many roles at different levels, not only addressing the challenges of a health pandemic, but also the social crisis, the democracy, the cultural crisis that we face. Do you believe that your university has been up to the task?
Yes, Hilligje, I believe our university has been up to the task, although some people think maybe we are not doing enough. I believe we are up to the task in the circumstances. But before I tell you why I think we are up to the task, let me just make a brief comment on the issue of access and the democratization of higher education. I think we must discuss that in the context of the regions. If in the OECD countries, 70 to 80% of the population have access to higher education, in Africa, it is 8%, 10 times less. So the parameters are completely different. The priorities are completely different when you begin discussing what do we do. Now, on the issue of universities participating in a political decision and so on, we have at Makerere a forum which we call the Geopolitics of Kampala, and we have this every year, a public debate on the politics of the country and politics of the region and world politics. And we have a whole week of debates with people from the public and from the university professors, students, all discussing freely the issues that affect our country, that affect the region and the globe. And this is because we are a university, so people have relative freedom to speak when they are here within the confines of the university. We also have a lot of our academic staff who write in the mass media on issues affecting the politics of the country almost on a daily basis. And our policy is people have their political and academic freedom. We don't interfere with what they are saying. And for, at least for now, I have not seen that any of them is getting harassed maybe by the state because of what they are writing and so on. So yes, we have played what I think is our role. We have tried to fulfill it within the circumstances within which we are working. But I want you to remember what I told you, only 8% of our population have access to higher education. And very many decisions are taken basing that in mind.
Yes, that's a very, very important point you make. And that is certainly something that requires much more attention, because I'm not always convinced that around the world that is a figure that people have clearly in mind. Some do, but maybe not all. So Paul, maybe would you try and also pick up on that question? Well,
yes, I would say I'd like to talk about this issue really on several different levels. Certainly at the national level, our universities have stepped up, in particular, given the last 4 years that we've lived through in the US, where in fact our political leaders were really running counter to many of the kind of key democratic values of our institutions. And so there was some banding together of universities in organizations actually addressing immigration, addressing climate change, addressing equity and inclusion challenges. And so I think in many ways, as a broader community, the higher education landscape here really did step in. I think during the pandemic, it's been interesting because most of the kind of chief spokespeople, on all the major media, in fact, are coming out of university, public health experts and the like. So there really has been a call for those voices to be heard in the midst of this. I would want to focus, though, also on the fact that this is also a local issue, at least in the U.S. context. I mean, we live in particular spaces where, in fact, that work gets done with local officials. And so this movement that is growing across the globe, and now that Ira, has certainly been one of the leaders in the anchor institution movement for Augsburg, for example, that means that we are an anchor in a neighborhood, in a city, where in fact we are working with local officials to meet the needs of our neighborhood, of our neighbors, and in particular in this pandemic, where Augsburg's located in a neighborhood that is primarily immigrants. That's become particularly important, where we become advocates for their well-being, for their both health as well as economic well-being. Right now, we're working closely with our public health folks because we have a kind of anti-vaccine thread that runs through some of those communities. So how can we be partners with those public health folks in the kind of trustworthy relationships that we've built on the ground? And I think in that way, the pandemic has again only put a point on the importance of institutions understanding their role outside the boundaries of their campuses. Yes, I want to keep my faculty, staff, and students safe and healthy, but I also need to care about those who are in the neighborhoods around us. And our work as an anchor institution has been one of the ways that we've been able to influence policy as well as practice in our city.
Maybe you can put in the chat a link to Anchor's institutions work, because not everybody around the world knows that they can guess what it is, but the principle is interesting to share. Naoto, I would like to also maybe hear from you in Japan. Do you believe that the universities, Tokai or Tsukuba or Tokyo or any of the universities around the country have been called to comment on what is happening, and also for their expertise to be voiced at discussion tables when it comes to addressing the various forms and shapes that the pandemic has taken? Do you believe that this part of the university, or the university, has taken part in these conversations?
Well, I think in Japan's case, from the beginning, government doesn't really force to what we have to do, just giving us a policy. And so since we have a medical school, and the medical school also provided to accommodate how to deal with in order to protecting a student, faculty, and the staff, how to dealing with COVID-19. And we had made a task force. Each, of course, we didn't know what exactly going on. So each time we discussed and we try to do how to deal with, we take care of ourselves. For example, our school has my campus where I'm working is 27,000 students. And we have a couple of the campus. Altogether, we have 30,000 students in Japan. So we have a kind of responsibility also the community, not to spread out also the this pandemic to the communities. So, and all of the students, all of the faculty and the staff, we understand that. And so following to the actually the medical school's guide, and we follow that. And of course, medical school, we have 4 hospitals. And the hospitals also have to take care of also the pandemic's patient. So we try to contribute as much like this. And also we getting a daily information from the basically medical school. And many of the schools, they have a medical school or a medical research institute. They also contributed to the actually the scientific part of the information to the government. And but we actually utilize it, try to also protecting not only our university members, also the communities. That's we believe that's all of the university feel like that is a responsibility. So, and the government didn't really even the lockdown, even the Tokyo at this moment, so-called state of emergency, but didn't force to lock down. So it's a kind of a different situation from the other countries, I really believe.
Thank you very much. Then there is another question I will ask, just one quick question to each, and then I turn to you, Ira, is that okay? Where there is a question asked by Loretta Morudu, which is also actually talking to some of the issues that the various panelists raised. Pre-COVID already, there were many discussions, and even you, Sjur, asked that question in the beginning. Pre-COVID, there were already many uneasy discussions about more funding for higher education. And today we see that there is an increased call for assisting universities in moving online and the whole accompanying the whole digital transformation of higher education. So Loretta was asking, will we have the opportunity to really balance our budgets to address both and the brick and mortar demands and needs that were there before, and now the digital transformation of higher education and everything that comes with it. Also the question of Barnabas, that universities need to accommodate many more people, and that in Africa countries should probably go from 8 to 80% the next year. No, that's not possible. But there is a real need for increased access. So all that issue of finances between governments and between institutions, will we see that as coming? Or what is your perception on that? So the financial side of things, where we also know that the pandemic did cost so much in terms of addressing the challenges of today, ensuring our societies and countries continue to thrive approximately in the given situation. So what about the future? Will there be money left for higher education? Maybe that's the question. Ligia, can you start with that?
Well, I think there are various funds that are going to be used to sort of prepare ourselves better for the future. In Europe, we have the Resilience and Recovery funds, and in Romania's case, about 10–11% of that big pot of money will be used for education, in fact, including higher education, with a focus on things like digitalization, but also when it comes to education for sustainable development and things that have to do with that, from infrastructure to learning platforms and to resources of all kinds. So there has been an influx of EU money going into precisely this type of activities, in addition to research money, which of course will complement what comes through this resilience and recovery plan. Now, when it comes to public money, I would say that there is a pressure on the public budgets everywhere, and it's clear that many countries prioritize mandatory education years for obvious reasons. They need to ensure the right to education. And so universities are sometimes not beneficiaries of the brunt of this money for recovery or for complementing the existing demands. What I think must happen is to perhaps see what some of the savings of this last year, because we know that many universities, had to keep paying their salaries, but they had other areas in which, of course, they could save, while at the same time investing in others. I think that the budgets of universities will probably suffer changes, especially if this blended learning format will remain in place. The public responsibility to fund higher education, but at the same time, I think the financing model of universities might change in light with this new formats, and also in line with the new objectives that we set for higher education.
So there are 2 minutes left for the three other speakers. Barnabas, in 2 minutes, would you wish to say something? Otherwise, I will have a trouble with Ira. So please, if you could, in 2 minutes, say something about it. Paul, same, and Naoto. So Barnabas, please.
Okay, Japan is also, I think, a government fund to the university is getting reduced, and significantly. So we have to find out also cooperate with companies, especially research fund, and we have to find out a different way to also not to depend on the government fund, I think, especially like us, private university.
Yeah, that will be a challenging one, a topic for a next webinar, I'm sure. Barnabas?
Well, I think despite the challenges in Uganda, the government has actually been increasing funding to public universities. And for the first time, they actually even gave a lot of money for research. And they are sustaining that even through the COVID pandemic. However, the government is constrained to support the private universities, which take up more than 50% of all the university students. Some of these universities are actually collapsing because they cannot really sustain themselves because they depend on student fees, and the students are too poor now to pay. The government here, and I think in many parts of the world of Africa, has one big priority now. How do you keep the large number of youth who are coming into the economy, either employed or somehow satisfied with whatever they are doing? So that is the biggest problem which all these governments face, and I'm very sure a lot of money is going to go into that area, and education might suffer.
Yes. So we have a lot of advocacy to do there. I see also as an IAU and the Council of Europe and the International Consortium. So Paul, please.
Just quickly, of course, the US system is very different. As a private university, we would normally not receive any direct funding from the government. But in fact, there have now been 3 COVID relief bills that have been passed by our Congress. Each one has included significant funding for both private and public universities to help us weather this. And the interesting thing about the funding is that about half of it has been for institutional needs, that is to make up for lost revenue or for extra expenses, and half has been dedicated to go directly to students. So really an understanding of the emergency needs that students also had. You know, that's not going to continue beyond this. We've probably seen the last, but it helped us weather this. And I would say that going forward, the most important funding we get from the government is actually the funding that goes to students through federal financial aid, which allows them the choice of where to go to university, as opposed to that money going directly to universities. So.
Yeah, very large questions anyway. I'm very pleased to soon give the floor to you, Ira. I would like to thank from my side already the excellence and the excellent speakers, and as well thank all the participants for the great questions in the chat and in the Q&R. And I'm sure that in the next webinar to also debate the various papers in the book, we will have the opportunity to enrich our discussion and the questions we will ask thanks to those. So Ira, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hilligje, very much. And first, I want to thank you for convening us in IAU's role. And I want to thank certainly you for your wonderful questions that you were able to pose with the participants, and Sjur for your moderating so expertly, and also to certainly thank my colleagues who did just an extraordinary job in providing a rich overview of the differences and similarities in this work. And what I'd like to do is actually highlight what Naoto said, Barnabas, Paul, and Ligia, as examples of larger thematics that I think come across here. The first thing I want to say is that one thing that comes across very clearly is how influential higher education is as an institution. This is no epiphenomenon, second-rate institution. It isn't just government or the economy. It points to the power of higher education, and indeed by doing that, the entire educational sector. And when we look at this, we look at the areas of influence that you all have described, the 4 of you, and they're really powerful. And I like to frame this in the following way, is that what this crisis did is something that Barnabas started with. He said, dangerous situations, in effect, bring things together, that there were issues that required people to act. And if we think of the areas that you all identified as so central, we could start with health and the role that higher education played, from medical schools to other health components to dealing with the crisis in relation to providing supports, medical equipment, reaching out to communities in need. And as Naoto said, this would not have been possible unless we first deal with the health problem. And that was first has to be dealt with. But immediately one went into then the questions of higher education itself and the mobilization of higher education as learning institutions to deal with their students in appropriate ways, trying to produce the best online and outreach education possible in these very, very difficult circumstances. But that wasn't all that was discussed. You raised the other dilemmas of the dilemma of inequality, of inequity. And I'm going to turn to that more in a moment, but that's across the board. That was an issue that you identified as occurring in many, many different areas. And then, of course, the issue that was raised very, very clearly is the question of democracy itself. When Ligia indicates the ideas for fact-checking and the need to check on issues related to truth and honesty and science, that comes across as a powerful example of why democracy was in the forefront of much of this. And I would go further, that if we had people from some other countries here, and Paul actually touched on this for the United States, that democracy could well have become a casualty of the pandemic. And the issue of higher education's role, and the issue that we have to do more, but I believe steps were certainly taken. And then the issue, if we go to inequality, something that came up very, very strongly was the issue again of digital divide and the question of what is the way best of mobilizing online education to be effective. Now, those areas are so varied and so powerful, and it indicates clearly that higher education played a profound role in dealing with those crises and those problems. And what I think my colleagues were so brilliantly able to do was to highlight themes that come across that we need to consider. And I like to discuss those and then turn to steps forward as I conclude. And what I would want to say is the phrases that were used here very early in the conversation had a power. Naoto's statement about the need, two things came across very powerfully for global citizenship. The idea that we need to educate our students for more than just careers and technical success. And then you posed at the end a profoundly important issue for us, the role of dialogue, the role of conversation, the role of working in a learning environment in which we learn the skills of citizenship and of working together. That proposes a tremendous issue in this pandemic and post-pandemic world. How is that best done? And what kind of priority does global citizenship need to have in this current period, and the extent to which that dialogue is so crucial? You know, related to that point was an emphasis that Paul made on democracy as a social ethic. The idea that we're not speaking about democracy in higher education in terms of just educating students to be voters, well, that's crucially important. But the idea of how democracy needs to infuse the entire society, and Paul's emphasis, and emphasis of all of you to some extent, varying extents actually, that indeed democracy and education needs to occur not just in the political realm, but in the realm of all other aspects of society. And a certain issue relates to this through online or not online education, face-to-face, the idea that democracy as a way of life. The role that higher education has in all of the various areas that you've identified, health, education, democracy itself, inequities in society, all of these areas are components of how one builds what the Council of Europe would term a democratic culture. These are components and crucial that raises these issues to an extraordinary sense. And then that raises the issue of then how do we judge higher education? Ligia's phrase, how do we assure quality? How do we assure in the new context what quality means? It cannot be the same old rankings as before. What are you ranking for if you take the old rankings? You're ranking for the old world, pre-COVID-19, and I don't think it worked then, and I'll get to that momentarily. And then Paul indicated, in fact, going back to this theme of larger role of higher education, democracy as being crucial in the sense what you want is a democratic excellence. A range of aspects and components of human life that need to be measured in terms of a learning environment. And then, of course, I think that what this raises, and I'm moving forward toward the ending, I know I only have about 3-4 minutes, but that in fact, that idea of democratic excellence and fits into thinking about things differently. And Barnabas had this wonderful issue and phrase that also Paul and others picked up on, and Naoto, the idea that what the crisis pointed out were problems that currently existed that higher education needed to deal with. I think, Barnabas, you went so far as to call it a blessing to deal with those problems. So the issue is even with this terribly difficult situation, whether blessing or not, that these were deeply, the previous normal was not appropriate for what we need for our society. That seems to me to be a powerful finding of your work, of all your work. And then it raised the issue, and now I'll try to move on this, of what should our priorities be indeed going forward. And I'm going to touch on a few of those priorities, if I might, and then turn to where we might go from here. One priority clearly was cooperation globally. One of you said brilliantly, we are all in this together. We need each other, and we need global community in order to solve it. I just listened to the four of you today, and how much I learned from the different situations. I reread the book a bit last night, but hearing it again was just very powerful, how much we need each other. Then the issue of how do we figure out as a priority, what's the appropriate mix for different countries of face-to-face and online learning? If you take the issue of Naoto's emphasis on the question of personal face-to-face dialogue and Barnabas's imperative, we got to move from that 8%. We have to, and online is the only way forward, raises different societal issues, but also as priorities going forward. And how do we do what we do better than we've done it before becomes very, very crucial. And now just to conclude with a few general points, if we take those as priorities, what I'm going to say is that you need to lead with what Sjur started with, values. That the question that emerges now is to reach the highest values of higher educations and our individual and collective societies around the world. The values of a democratic purpose, of that broader purpose, not just education for jobs and the market, but education for life and for education for a good society for all, of maximum contribution and engagement. The emphasis on access, the idea that we cannot be exclusive institutions, but need to open our doors for the learning for everyone, either by opening doors or opening online education, becomes absolutely crucial. The need, therefore, if we're talking about access, for inclusivity, not just one population group, but all populations, where higher education reflects the actual composition of our societies. And then I think this raises issues of where we go from here, and I will conclude with funding on this issue. The last two, I would say, as we think of reaching those values, we indeed have to do it globally, as global citizens. But we also have to do it, as Paul emphasized, locally. Locally, not just with our students, but with our neighbors. We need to build democratic local communities that connect our learning to the people in our environments through online, as Ligia talked about, working with the community, to more face-to-face knowledge. And then I will just conclude with this notion, as you concluded with funding, I would believe that by focusing on the democratic purpose that you indicated, by indicating higher education's enormous influential role, where it indeed can do more of an influential role, where you emphasize the need for inclusion, access, and the need for higher education to assure a democratic future, that seems to me the best platform to assure funding now and into the future, as we illustrate our public purpose and our purpose to assure a fair, decent, and just society for all our citizens, and a decent quality of life in all of our societies and around the world. So thank the four of you very much for your extraordinary conversations. It has been a pleasure to try to summarize all the wonderful things you've said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this. Sjur, would you like to have the closing remark as we will close the session? Thank everyone, and maybe remind that we will have next sessions as well.
Simply to thank everyone for rising to the format of the session, for really bringing about, I think, a fascinating discussion. Thank you for to all the participants. And maybe a final thought. I mean, one of my favorite quotes about education comes from a Chilean sociologist called Hilligje, who says, you know, if you want to ask if you want to know what kind of education we need, you first have to answer a different question, which is what kind of society do we want? Well, we want a society, obviously, without COVID, but we also want a society that draws the lessons from the COVID crisis. And I think one of the challenges we face as higher education people, as universities, is to make sure that we don't do what we did with the so-called Spanish flu a century ago. I mean, we know it was important. We don't quite know why and what we learned from it by this stage. Let's make sure, first of all, that 100 years from now, the COVID crisis is still the last the public health crisis. But also, let's make sure that we learn the lessons as societies and as higher education of the COVID crisis. We will not be the same again, but let's be better, not worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's great to be
Thank
with
you,
you.
wonderful.
Great closing, Ira and Sjur. Thank you, Hilligje.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.